interesting topic. We'll dive into the topic we're going to look at today, which is the topic of zealotry, which is an interesting topic for me, especially because it seems to touch on both religious and political themes that seem so prominent for us in the world today. Part of what's fascinating about the idea of zealotry is that when we often associate it with a religious context, it's very easy to start seeing how the idea also manifests in other contexts, particularly political contexts as well. And as such, I think because we live in times of instability and also times of extremism, like this question of zealotry, I think becomes a very, very, very important one. Both, again, where I live in Israel and certainly in America as well, where political discourse always seems to be at the edge of violence. And there's this sense that, people have to step up and do what's right, no matter what the cost, because the moment demands it, right? And that kind of thinking is often, as we'll see, very much at the heart of zealotry, right? On a more basic religious level, I don't just live in Israel; I also live in Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the holy city, and Jerusalem is a holy city, but it also has basically a 2,000-year plus reputation for also being a city of zealots, right? If you want to find a religious zealots in the world, right, this city, where I live is usually a good place, right? The old city, the Ir Atika, has historically been full of them, of all different kinds of religions, right? So for me, at least, also living where I live, right, the image of a religious zealot, and often a political zealot as well, is not something just that's rooted in history. It's rooted very much in the contemporary reality. Now, for me, part of the reason, again, that I wanted to get into this was again, the contemporary relevance of it. But Rav Shmuley and I share a teacher from yeshiva, and he happens to come from a Hasidic background that is famous for its zealotry. And he happened to quote on Facebook, this was a couple of years ago, and when I read this, it really hit me. He said as follows, he says, true when done wrong, zealotry can be hurtful, damaging, and destructive. But that doesn't mean that we should completely dismiss it as a virtue. Done appropriately at the right time, with the right amount, while exhibiting extreme caution, zealous religious passion can be spiritually beneficial. Right. And what he was trying to get at, and well, I'm going to sort of challenge this because I think there's what here to be challenged. But what he was trying to get at is there's something good about zealotry, right? As long as it's not too much, as long as it's done carefully. But if done right, with the right amount and the right sort of focus, the right kavanah, right, some good consequences can come out of it. And in general, he likes to make the argument that modern Jews, liberal Jews, are too uncomfortable with zealotry. Right, they should be trying to integrate more zealotry into their lives, because there's good things that come from that. So I think this notion of zealotry being like a good thing, but we don't want too much of it, but we need something of it, right? Like I want to question that, because I think fundamentally what we have to keep in mind, and I think this is something the Jewish texts make us deeply aware of, is that whatever we think of zealotry, it's something radical. Right, it's something which challenges the normal way of doing things. It's something which challenges the system and even potentially challenges authority and the basic norms through which we live our lives. Right, so zealotry is not just simply like a good thing, but just not too. We don't want too much of it. There's something I want to argue much more radical that is potentially going on here. And what we're going to do in the shiur is basically we're going to explore probably the most fundamental and important narrative around zealotry that exists in the Torah, and that is the narrative of Pinchas and the act of zealotry that he takes up. What is fascinating is that when we look closely at the narrative, we see how his actions are paradigmatic of the way zealotry is conceived throughout the Torah, throughout Jewish thought even today, in ways that become very, very important for us to try to understand. And we're not just going to look at Jewish texts, or at least traditional Jewish texts. I also want to try to bring a psychoanalytic lens to this question, because I think psychoanalysis has something very important to teach us about what is it exactly that fuels the zealot, and what might be so problematic about that. So even before I get into the text with Pinchas, I want to just pose the question of what exactly does it mean to be a zealot, right? It's not, it's a term we use. It's a term that it's sort of like, the classic, Supreme Court statement about pornography. It's like, I know it when I see it, right? Everybody sort of has an image in their mind of what the zealot is, but it's not exactly so clear how we might define what makes the zealot a zealot, what makes zealotry. So I want to just begin by posing a few definitions, and then we'll continue to play off them throughout this year. So one possibility about the zealot, and this is what we see maybe in some ways most clearly in Pinchas's story, is the zealot is somebody who takes the law into their own hands, right? The zealot is the one who sees that there's a problem, who sees that there's something that needs to happen, something that the law demands, something, let's say, the Torah demands, but it's not being done, right? So in the absence of anybody doing what needs to be done, right, the zealot steps up and says, okay, I'm going to do it, right? Like, I'm not the judge, I'm not the king, I'm not the prophet, I'm not the rabbi, but somebody has to act, right, for God. So I'm going to take the law into my own hands. Right, that's one possibility of what the zealot is, from a religious perspective. And again, you can see how that translates into sort of a modern secular narrative as well, right? There's a moment of crisis. There's a moment of which there's a sense of things becoming degraded, right? There's a moment in which the political system isn't doing what it's supposed to, right? Somebody has to step up and take the law into their own hands, right? The law demands it, right? It's not even that they're acting outside the law. Right, the law says you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z. There shouldn't be corruption. There shouldn't be abuse of power. But if those in authority aren't going to do it, like, somebody else has to step up and make sure that it can and should happen. So that's one possibility of zealotry, taking the law into one's own hands. And another way to think about zealotry is this idea of going beyond the law. Right, the law says X, but we know that X isn't good enough. Right, we have to go beyond the law to make sure that what needs to happen is actually able to happen, right? And if we think about this from like a social justice perspective, I mean, this is one that we very clearly understand, right? There are many places in which the law falls far short of what we think the basic ethical standard, ethical mandate needs to be in a particular situation, right? So in those kinds of contexts, right, it's our responsibility to go beyond the letter of the law. But of course, going beyond the letter of the law, even if we think it's right, in the particular context in which that act takes place, that act is often seen as a transgression, because if you go beyond the letter of the law, that means you're acting outside the law, right? You're doing what the law doesn't give you permission to do, right? And that's what gives, again, the act of zealotry its excessiveness, right? When a social justice protester, right, handcuffs themselves to, police cars to prevent some sort of, action that they see as an abuse of power, right? Like, the law doesn't give them permission to do that act of, nonviolent resistance, let's say. But it's exactly, justice and this need to go beyond sort of the letter of the law as it is understood in this particular political place and time, right, that demands the zealot to act. But again, in the eyes of the police, right, the conscientious objector, the protester who chains themselves, right, that's an illegal act. That's a transgression. They should be locked up and put into jail. And policemen in those contexts often look, I assume, at protesters as if they're crazy zealots for acting outside the law in that kind of way. The third definition I'll put out there, and this is, I think, is in some ways the most common one that we probably most intuitively think about when it comes to zealotry, is the zealot is the one who is willing to use violence to impose their beliefs on others. Right. And I think that's, like I said, something we intuitively get, right? The zealot is one who doesn't just believe something to be true, right? But that's not enough for them, right? They have a fundamental need to make sure that other people accept that truth as true. And they have a willingness to use violence in order to be able to enforce that. And again, we see that also today, again, in political and religious discourse. I live in a city where there are many, many rabbis and a country where people feel that their religious beliefs are so important, it's not just enough that they be allowed to live them, right? It is of even greater importance that they be imposed on others, and the use of violence is completely legitimate for that, right? And I think for a lot of us who have a basic sense of human rights and a basic sense of human beings being created in the image of God, right? The idea that we're going to use violence to impose religious beliefs on others is deeply concerning to us. And we might even think it's evil. I certainly do most of the time. But that's what the zealot thinks, right? If it's from God, if the truth is from God, how could we be willing to compromise on it, right? Everybody needs to live by it. And that means we're going to have to use force. We're going to have to use violence at times. We don't want to, but if that's what God's law requires, if that's what God's, word, God's will demands, then that's just the way it's going to have to be. Right. So these are just some of the, possible ways of thinking about zealotry. And again, they kind of blend into each other. I'm not saying they're truly defined, distinguished categories, But I want us to have that in the background as we're looking at these texts, because in every moment when you're dealing with somebody who is acting zealously for good and for bad, right, they're operating, I would say, within one of these different paradigms here. So as I said, the major focus that we need to look at is the story of Pinchas, right? This appears towards the end of Sefer Bamidbar, the fourth book of the Torah. It's really a short narrative at the end. I think it's 15 verses or so. So I kind of like sometimes short narratives in the Torah because they give you sort of their totality in a graspable form, right? It's all there, right? And as most stories in the Torah, and this one is no exception, even though it's short, right, there is just so much in there, right? Like every verse, every word, every letter has something to teach about this sort of complex narrative that it's giving over. In the context of the Torah, right, this narrative comes after essentially the Jewish people have been marching through the desert, traveling in the desert, right? They've already been there for basically 40 years, and they're finally essentially on their way to go to the promised land, right? The generation that left Egypt, they've died in the desert, right? It's their children now who are essentially making their way to the promised land, which means it's supposed to be a new generation, a fresh start, a better chance at the covenant that God has made with the Jewish people. But even here we see that the Jewish people are not quite, rising to the challenge. And what happens where things start to break apart at the very beginning of the narrative is when the Jewish people the Jewish men start having relations with Midianite women. And as part of those sexual relations, they start worshiping Baal Peor. They start worshiping the Midianite gods. Right? We have this moment in which there's almost the sense of which the covenant between God and the Jewish people is rupturing through this dual act of sex with the idol worshipers and worshiping their idols. Right? There's a sense in which this story, we don't have time to fully develop it, but there's a sense in which this story parallels very much the incidents of the golden calf, right? At the moment when things are supposed to be going good and we're supposed to be moving forward, right? Like there's a moment of rupture in which it kind of feels like maybe everything could become undone, right? And that's sort of the setup. And the question is what happens next? So when we look here again, Midbar chapter 25, we're told that Israel was staying in Shittim. That's the place that they are. They profane themselves by being with the Moabite women. And the Moabite women essentially seduce the Jewish men to worship their gods, to offer sacrifice to their idols. And the men do this, right? They're happy to be seduced, one might say, or one might assume. And again, through part of this process, the Jewish men become attached to Baal Peor. They become attached to this sort of whole sexual idolatrous practices that are going on. And as one might expect, just as we saw in the case of the golden calf, when there's the rupture of the covenant, when the Jewish people betray their connection to God, their loyalty to God, how is God going to respond? Well, God's going to respond like any spurned, spouse, right, whose partner is basically betraying them with another person, right? And they're going to get angry. And that's exactly what we see here. It says, and the Lord was incensed with Israel. God's getting very, very angry. And God says to Moses, verse 4, he gives Moses very specific instructions. Take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord, so that the Lord's wrath may turn away from Israel. God gives Moshe very clear instructions. Take the ringleaders, who are the ones most responsible. He doesn't say kill everybody who's been doing this, but take the ringleaders and kill them and make a public show of it, right? Send the message, right? This was wrong. This was a total violation, right? The ringleaders need to be killed, and this needs to be done in a public way so that we can solve this problem. And that's the instruction that Moshe passes down to basically the people who assist him in running the nation. It says here in verse 5, so Moshe turns to the Israelite officials, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor, right? You guys got to go out and find those that were doing this. You have to kill them. And then we're told, so the instructions have been, there's crisis, right? But God, the authority, has given the proper instructions how we're going to rectify this. Moshe, his servant, his emissary, has passed on these directions to the people so they can implement them, so things can be fixed. And then we're told what happens next here in verse 6. And this is really the transition point that is the trigger for Pinchas's actions. It says here in verse 6, just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions. in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community. So what's happening in the midst of Moses, God giving the instructions, Moses giving the instructions, we're going to find the ringleaders, we're going to kill them, we're going to make a show of it. There's one Jewish man, who comes in front of everybody with his Midianite woman partner. And again, it doesn't say what they're doing at first. They all just sort of come together in front of not just Moses, but ultimately all of the people. And we're told here that they are weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting, right? So again, the Israelite man brings one of his women before everybody, and they are crying as they see this taking place in the Ohel Moed, at the tent of meeting, right? And again, we have to keep in mind here, and it's, I would say, explicit, implicit, so to speak, in the text, is the assumption he's here is he's not just like bringing his non-Jewish girlfriend around, but that they're engaged in the act of relations itself, right? That there's something profoundly provocative and transgressive about what they're doing, right? If we're going to use sort of the modern, metaphor here, it's like if you're in shul on Yom Kippur or on Shabbos, right? And one of your shul members is coming and bringing, whatever, basically doing a transgressive act with another person in a way that is problematic, like on the bima, right? Like in front of everybody, right? And what's important for us to keep in mind here is when this moment of transgression, of rupture really takes place in front of everybody, in front of the leader, what is their response, right? What is it that Moshe and everybody does when they see this happen? Well, we're only told one thing, and that is that they cry, right? Which again is striking, right? We might imagine, if we think of Moshe of the golden calf, like what does Moshe of the golden calf do when he sees the people are sinning, right? He smashes the tablets. He says, Mila Hashem Elai, or he gathers people together to go after them. Here, that's not the Moshe that we see, right? Here we see a Moshe who is basically passive, crying, helpless, powerless. And that is the moment when Pinchas chooses to act, right? It says here in verse 7, when Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelites and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Right? So Pinchas, in this moment, is where he takes the spear and he does what he feels must be done. Right? He kills the Jewish man and the Midianite woman. He stabs them. Again, it's very visceral here. Right, and the Torah is very clear about that. He takes the spear and he stabs both of them right through the belly, right through the center of their bodies. And then we're suddenly told about this plague that we didn't know about before, but whatever that was is stopped, right? Presumably the plague is an expression of God's wrath. And then we're told those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. Right, so Pinchas engages in this zealous act of violence in this moment of profound transgression. And what's very clear from the Torah's perspective is that there are some very positive outcomes that occur because of this, right? All the Jews that have been dying, right? Well, the death of the plague of God's anger comes to an end with this, right? And as we continue with the verses, this is more or less where the Parsha ends, Parsha Balak, but then we go on to Pinchas, and it's very clear that that God seemingly looks at this as a good thing, right? So we're told here in verse 10, God spoke to Moshe saying, again, so we sort of like are waiting for a moment. So what's going to be the response to this? It appears it's a good thing. God's wrath stops, the plague stops, but what's really going to be the final word here? It says here in verse 10, the Lord spoke to Moshe saying, Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship, Briti Shalom, right? That God is saying, you know what? Pinchas did a good thing. And not only did he do a good thing by staying my wrath through this act of zealotry, I'm going to reward Pinchas. I'm going to give him the Brit, this covenant, this pact of friendship. And he goes on to say, God, it shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites, right? This gift that God gives to Pinchas is not just for Pinchas, it's for Pinchas' descendants. That's how important it was, because what Pinchas did actually, prevented the Jewish people from being destroyed. And then we're told who's the name of the Israelite man and the Midianite woman who did this, Zimri, who is from the tribe of Shimon, and Cosby, who is the Midianite woman, who's the daughter of Tzur. So what's important to keep in mind as we look at this narrative is that it does seem to see this act of zealotry, this violent act of zealotry, as being a good thing, right? That there are moments when people are sinning, people are doing horrible things, and you know what? You got to be willing to step up and do what's necessary sometimes, right? Like you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, and you can't save a country, a society, a community without, killing people if it's necessary, right? And that's essentially seemingly what the message is here, right? If you read this story and you're asking, is the Torah pro-zealotry or against zealotry, it's kind of hard. I mean, there's some subtle points we'll look at, but the straightforward reading of this is kind of like, when it's necessary, this is what you got to do. This is what God wants. And not only that, it can be, basically bring salvation. It can cause, very good things to happen for the Jewish people. So when we see this, we do see that the Torah seems to say zealotry may be a good thing. It may be a necessary thing. Now, what's striking to us, again, as modern people, but it was certainly striking to the rabbis of the Talmud as well, is that we all kind of know that acts of violence perpetrated in the name of God rarely have sort of the positive outcomes that the people who engage in them think that they should, right? Like most often, what are the consequences of religious acts of violence, right? Most often the consequences are more violence, right? If people think that an act of zealotry is going to bring others to faith, right? Violent act of zealotry, right? There are other ways you conceive of zealotry, but a violent act of zealotry, killing somebody, I think most of us would say that is much more likely to profane God's name than it is to sanctify God's name. That's just our assumption with it. I don't know about you. Anybody here can think of a great act of religious zealotry that was killing somebody in the last century or two that was like, strengthen their faith? I would have a hard time coming up with an example. What I want to do now is we turn to Chazal, and we're going to turn to some, again, like I said, psychoanalysis and Jewish thoughts. I want us to unpack like what's really going on here, right? Is this such a wonderful thing? Should we all try to become zealots when the moment requires it? Or is there something more going on? And what is it that really is bringing zealotry to the fore in the first place? Because one of the things we have to keep in mind, if we live in a moment where zealotry feels more palpable, we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? And I think this story, when you read between the lines, actually helps explain why that might be the case. So first, I want to look at sort of the rabbinic ambivalence around Pinchas's actions here of zealotry. The rabbis, again, they can't say it's like totally prohibited, because the Torah seems to go out of its way to make clear that God said this was, a good thing and necessary. But at the same time, the rabbis themselves are deeply concerned about what kind of precedent this might represent. And they start reading, I think, some very, very important things into this. There are, in some ways, I would say pshat, but not necessarily highlighted in the biblical verses themselves. So the first thing I will note here is that when you look at the Mishnah Masechet Sanhedrin, there is an explicit Mishnah that says, when it comes to three particular sins, if you see somebody doing them, you can kill them, right? Doesn't say this about all the sins, not even necessarily the sins that we might think, right? But there are three particular sins that if you see somebody engaging with them, you can kill them, right? You don't have to wait for them to come to court and be judged by a Beit Din and have a proper death penalty be implemented, right? In the moment when you see the sin, right, like you can kill them. I'll note that the Mishnah itself is already ambiguous whether or not you should kill them, but it does make very clear that you can kill them, right? And that's, important just to understand here. It says, with regard to, and here are the three sins, one who steals a kasva, which is one of those sacred vessels from the temple that was used in the temple, or one who curses with a sorcerer, right? Or one who engages in intercourse with an Aramean woman, right? In these three instances, if you see these things happening, like in the middle of seeing it happening, zealots strike them and kill them. It can strike him and kill them, right? You see this happening, you could do like Pinchas does. You can pick up your spear and you can kill them. Now, again, we're not going to tend to unpack the other two, but clearly these are transgressive acts, idolatrous acts, sexual acts, right? These are the sort of like the area, the parsha, so to speak, that we're dealing with. They all involve some sort of rupture, fundamental rupture of the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people. When we turn to the Talmud in its discussion of this particular Mishnah, as I said, we're going to see a lot of ambivalence. Already the Mishnah is ambivalent by not saying you should do this, just saying that it can happen, right? The Gemara is already going to start adding very, very, very important caveats for how we look at this. So the Gemara here in Masechet Sanhedrin, it says, Rav Chisda said, concerning one who comes to consult with the court, when he sees a Jewish man engaging in intercourse with a Gentile woman, the court does not instruct him that it is permitted to kill the transgressor. Right? It was also stated that Rabbi Bar Chana said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, concerning when it comes to consult with the court does not instruct him that he is permitted to kill the Jewish man engaged in intercourse with a Gentile woman. So the first point Chazal make here, and this is a very, very important one, it sounds counterintuitive, we'll see it almost sounds like paradoxical, is that if you are a rabbi or you're a Beit Din, and somebody comes up to you and asks, I see, Shloimi, engaged in this great transgression, right? This public transgression of having sex with an idolater, right? Like, can I go kill him right now? Right? The Gemara is saying, no, you don't answer, right? The rabbi doesn't answer, the Beit Din doesn't answer. And the reason this is a little bit paradoxical is because, first off, it's written in the Mishnah, so you might say it's already there, it's also paradoxical because, again, like the Torah seems to say this canon should happen. And so it's very strange that we would say that if this is the law that it can be done, why is it that the rabbi or the Beit Din isn't going to answer when somebody comes to ask the question? Right. So we're going to leave that open for the moment. Like, where is this idea coming from? Not so clear. The second caveat that Chazal, let me say it a little differently. But at the very least, what we can take away from this is that if you're a rabbi or a Beit Din, right, like you don't go teaching people to become zealots, right? That in some ways is a violation of the halacha, because if somebody asks you, you're not supposed to answer, which means you're also not supposed to be running around teaching this, right, at a certain level. So even though it's on the books, it's not something that we publicize. It's not something that we say you have permission to do this. That's the first caveat. The second caveat here, it says as follows: moreover, if Zimri, son of Salu, had separated himself from the woman, and only then Pinchas killed him, Pinchas would have been executed for killing him, because it is permitted for zealots to kill only while the transgressor is engaged in the act of intercourse. Right? And the same is going to say here is true with Zimri. Furthermore, if Zimri would have turned and killed Pinchas in self-defense, he would not have been executed for killing him, as Pinchas was a pursuer. One is allowed to kill a pursuer in self-defense, provided the pursued is not liable to be executed by the court. So what the Gemara is saying here, what the rabbis are saying here, is that Pinchas was permitted to kill them in this act of zealotry, but only while they were in the midst of the sin. Right? The moment they separated from the sin, right, Pinchas didn't have any right to use any kind of violence against them. And even more so, if he had attempted to use violence against them once they had separated, right, Zimri would have been completely within his rights to kill Pinchas, because at that point Pinchas would be coming at them as like a rodef, like as a murderer, right? And Zimri would be well within his rights to defend himself, right, under those kinds of conditions, which means that the act of zealotry, the rabbis are saying, is only essentially possible in the moments of the sin. But again, as we all know, especially when it comes to the sexual act, right, like that's a pretty small window, like pretty tiny window. It's not like you got hours to go after them, right? There's a moment. And if you get the moment wrong, you're a murderer, which I think is a very fundamental point here that we, again, sort of get, right? The line between being a zealot who somehow creates positive outcomes and the zealot who profanes God's name and engages in murder, right? It's a line that's so thin, right? It's essentially blurry and may not even quite be there. That's essentially what the rabbis are saying. If you get it right, like maybe you're a hero, but it is equally possible you will get it really, really, really wrong. And one of the ways the rabbis also get at this is in the same Gemara. They point out that when Pinchas killed Zimri and Cosby, it was as if 6 miracles happened at that moment, right? There were 6 different miracles that basically had to happen for Pinchas to do this right? Because it could have just as easily gone really, really, really wrong. Which again, the rabbis are kind of making their ambivalence very clear here. We're not going to tell you if and when and how you should be a zealot. And the window through which zealotry can be a positive thing is extraordinarily small. And it's far more likely that it's going to have destructive consequences, right? That's the basic, mahalach, the basic outline that's being, presented to us by the Gemara in relation to this biblical narrative, right? So we still have to ask ourselves, like, where is this notion of zealotry coming from? Like, what is it that is motivating Pinchas to do what he does? Because I think we have to get at this, we have to dig at this a bit more in order to be able to really understand the dynamics that are going on here. Right? On a certain level, I agree with Chazal completely, with the rabbis completely, right? Like, even if there's a place for zealotry, right, it's an extraordinarily narrow window where that can and should take place. And 99% of the time, it's going to be horrific, the attempt at it. But nevertheless, you have to understand, like, where does this legitimacy or this desire for zealotry come from? And to understand this, we're going to look at the Pinchas narrative. We're going to look at some broader biblical narratives, and we're going to have to bring in a bit of Sigmund Freud here as well to understand what is it that's making the zealot do what they do. So remember, if you remember before when I was describing the narrative, the Pinchas narrative, there was the particular moment I was trying to highlight that captures when Pinchas really rises up, right, and has to do something, right? And it was the 6th verse here. I'll just read it. I only brought the Hebrew, but it says as follows: V'hine ish mebnei Yisrael ba v'yakrev et elachav et hamidyanit le'enei Moshe le'nei kol dat bnei Yisrael, right? Zimri, the Jewish man, basically appears before Moshe and the entire Jewish people with his, Midianite partner, in presumably the sexual act. And how do they respond? And they are all crying, right? Not just the Jewish people, presumably, but Moshe is crying as well, right? So even though God has given instructions and Moshe has given instructions, when the transgression is thrown in their face, Moshe does not act like he did at Har Sinai with the golden calf. Moshe cries, right? And again, I think we all know this, when the authority figure who are looking to hold things together, to put down justice when necessary, when they don't act, when they appear powerless, right? There's something very scary about that. I think everybody, I'm going to be gendered for a moment here. I think every boy remembers the first time they see their father cry, because there's something about that is just like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? There's something really almost, I would say, again, maybe not in the world we live in today, but it used to be almost something traumatic about that, to see that, because that's not the way dad is ever supposed to be. Dad's supposed to be powerful, dad's supposed to be strong, dad's supposed to be stoic, right? To cry is, again, associated, unfortunately, with the gendered feminine, right? Is to be passive, is to be powerless. This isn't the Moshe we're supposed to see, right? And to see Moshe cry at this moment is a moment, again, of profound rupture. A moment where it kind of feels like maybe everything is falling apart, right? If Abba, the father, can't do what they're supposed to do in this moment, then all hell is potentially going to break loose. And it's when the father appears as potentially weak or absent, right? That is the moment when the sons have to step up and do what is necessary in the father's place. And the reason I'm speaking in those terms is, again, there's a Freudian dimension to that which I'll unpack, but this is very clear over and over again throughout the Torah itself. Right, there's a couple, I'll highlight 2 very clear examples of this. The first one is in Bereshit, the book of Genesis, when Jacob's daughter, Tamar, is raped by Shechem. When Yaakov discovers the rape, we're told as follows here. So this is in verse 5 from chapter 34 of Genesis. Jacob heard that Shechem, had defiled his daughter Dinah. But since his sons are in the field with his cattle, Jacob kept silent until they came home. So when Jacob, who's the patriarch, the father, hears that his daughter has been, raped, oppressed, defiled, right? What we want the father to do under those conditions is to take his sword and go after the people who did this horrible thing, right? That's the father's job, right? To, again, maintain and install justice, right? To make sure things are fair, to make sure that the family is protected, particularly the daughters, the women who are seen as being, again, vulnerable, less powerful, right? It's his job to make sure they're safe and secure. And when the father's not doing that, when authority is beginning to fail or no longer seen as this all-powerful authority, right? That's when the sons have to step in the father's place. And again, when the sons step in, they always, they have to do so in a zealous way, right? They have to, in some ways, I would even say, cover up for the fact that the father is being powerless, right? The son has to step in and say, no, this is what we do. We got to go this far. We got to rectify the problem in many ways to cover up for their own father's powerlessness. That's exactly what happens in the story here, right? What we're told is that Shechem comes to Yaakov and starts wanting to negotiate, basically, to have Tamar be his, sorry, I keep saying Tamar, Dinah. I don't know why I got Tamar stuck in my head, because that's coming connected story, but not the same one. Dinah, this is the rape of Dinah, right? So Shechem comes to Yaakov and basically wants to negotiate that Dinah should be his bride. And what happens is that Yaakov's other sons, Dinah's brothers, basically sort of trick Shechem and all of his people to circumcise themselves. And this is a way of sort of making an agreement between them, between Yaakov's family and the people of Shechem, so that their children will be able to marry each other and it'll be sort of a permanent relationship. But really, the plan is to get Shechem and his people to circumcise themselves so Shimon and Levi can take up arms and slaughter them. And that's exactly what happens in the narrative, right? We're told here again in verse 7, meanwhile, Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and were very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done, right? The sons are angry because the father, Yaakov, was not able to step in and protect. They come up with the whole plan, and the plan ends with Shimon and Levi just laying waste, killing thousands of Shechem and his people. Now you might say, well, again, what exactly does it have to do with zealotry? But later on in Bereshit, when Yaakov, at the end of Bereshit, when Yaakov rebukes Shimon and Levi, both Chazal and the Meforshim are very careful to link this also to the story of Pinchas, right? That they see Shimon and Levi's act of zealotry as being very much aligned with Pinchas's act of zealotry, right? That they're essentially doing the same kind of thing. When Yaakov is powerless, when the father is powerless, Shimon and Levi have to step up to protect their sister. When Moshe is powerless, not able to do what God wants, God needs, right? Pinchas has to step up violently and protect the Jewish people. When the father, who represents power and authority, isn't doing their thing, the sons have to step up and often violently. That's the basic narrative. The other example is, I'll just note, also occurs later on in Tanakh and Sefer Shmuel with David. Right, David has a whole host of children. Two of them are Amnon and Tamar. Is also what I was thinking of before. Amnon rapes his sister Tamar, and Avshalom, who's their other brother, when he sees that David does nothing, David knows the rape happens but does nothing. Avshalom is beyond upset, and Avshalom not only ends up killing Amnon, but ends up rebelling against his father, right? When the father is weak and not doing what they're supposed to do to protect the people who need to be protected, right? Then the son is going to, rise up and essentially, act, violently. And even within Chazal, I won't read it. They see that within the Pinchas narrative. They see that when Zimri is bringing the Midianite women before the people, he's actually challenging Moshe's authority. The Midrash actually goes on to say that what he's doing is he says to Moshe, "You're going to kill me? Look at you, Moshe. Look who your wife is." And if you know the narrative of the Torah, who's Moshe's wife? Zipporah. She's a Midianite woman, right? So essentially what Zimri is doing is challenging the very legitimacy of Moshe's authority to carry out God's judgment, right? And Moshe in that moment is essentially powerless. And that's why Pinchas has to step up. And there's this line in the Gemara here where it says, basically, when there's a profanation of God's name, we don't give honor to the rabbi, so to speak. We just do what's necessary, right? If the father's not able to stand up and do what they're supposed to do, then the sons have to get up and just act. Now, part of this whole way of thinking about zealotry, again, has to come from this position of understanding the way that power and authority is deeply tied to notions of patriarchy, right? It's the father who is the authority, and when the father is weak, the sons act zealously. Now, again, I know this sounds kind of, overly gendered from our modern perspective, but I will just note, right, Rosh Hashanah is coming, Yom Kippur is coming. One of the most famous prayers of those days is a prayer called Avinu Malkeinu, right? Our Father, our King, right? Judaism has always been, in many ways, deeply patriarchal in the way that it conceives of authority. That authority is often masculine, authority is often associated with the father. That's why God's not only our king, God is our father. Now, Judaism also undermines patriarchy. It undermines gender binaries in all sorts of ways, but there is a patriarchal dimension that it's hard to fundamentally escape from. And the reason that is relevant to us when we think about the modern condition is that the fundamental radical transformation of modernity is when the father stops being the father. Well, what do I mean by this? Is when, again, men stop being the embodiments of power and authority simply because they are men, right? It used to be, in fact, I once heard a Rosh Yeshiva who's much more to the right. It used to be as the sitcom was in the 50s, father knows best. And this Rosh Hashiva, I know I'm not always a huge fan of, he likes to say, I wish we could go back to the 1950s when it was father knows best, right? That's sort of patriarchal notions of authority. The father is the one who runs the family. The father was the one who knows how things should be done, right? One of the radical transformations of modernity is we no longer think father knows best, right? We think it's, hopefully the parents can kind of figure it out together in some sort of way, but it's certainly not father knows best, right? That if authority is male, right, a large part of modernity is about sort of killing the father in the Freudian Oedipal sense, right? We have to get rid of the father so there can be equal authority for everybody, right? That there's not one person at the top of the pyramid who essentially is embodying authority, right? But the challenge is when you get rid of authority as being located in a particular place or person, right? When you get rid of that being able to be the structure that holds society together, right? It is deeply destabilizing. Remember, as I keep saying, when the father is weak or the father is absent, that's the moment when zealotry starts to emerge. And that's the reason, I think, why we start seeing zealotry as such a temptation within political and religious life in the modern world, right? So this is a point made by very interesting psychoanalytic thinker, Richard Boothby, where he basically says as follows. He notes that religious zealotry and political zealotry in the modern world look really, really similar. And they are both fundamental responses to the loss of the father, the weakness of the father. And that what zealotry is always trying to do is basically the sons acting in an extreme way to give off the impression like the father's still the father. God's still in charge. I'm going to show you how God's still in charge, you silly modern liberals. I'm going to act in the most extreme way possible. Then nobody can question that God, the father, is really in charge. So here's what he says here. I'll just read the second paragraph. He says, if we look around the world, it is not difficult to see enormously larger numbers of men, indeed whole populations of them, who find themselves threatened by the disruptions and dislocations of modernity and react by sandbagging themselves in an anxious and aggressive reassertion of masculinity. Right? What we think of as toxic masculinity is not a pre-modern phenomenon. It's a response to the loss of masculinity being this privileged position of authority. And then men suddenly don't know what to do with themselves. And again, it's not just a gender problem, it's a societal problem, because when power and authority is conceived of as masculine, right, and you no longer say men are the ones in charge, then you have to ask yourself, who's in charge? Right? There has to be somebody in charge. And suddenly that becomes like as if the ground underneath you has simply, split open and you're standing over the abyss. He says the most visible evidence of this trend is to be found in the dark brothers of modern democratic enlightenment, fascism and religious fundamentalism. And he calls them brothers because both fascism and religious fundamentalism are the zealots who need to act in the place when the father is weak or not there. Right? Modernity is about pushing God away. We don't turn to God to determine how to run society, right? This is separation of church and state, right? God is sort of out of the picture. We kill the father. We keep the father out of it so that there can be equality, so there can be freedom. But then that leaves us again with a gaping hole there that is profoundly disconcerting. Yeah, he says the emergence of these two distinctly modern phenomena provide an indirect proof of the profoundly anti-patriarchal character of the key movements of modernity, meaning modernity is all about, again, sort of getting rid of God as the father who knows best. Fascism and fundamentalism are essentially reactions to the modern erosion of traditionally patriarchal culture. They each represent defensive countermeasures, one secular and overtly militarist, the other theocratic and more covertly militarist. Both are essentially defensive rearguard actions that seek to mitigate the decline of patriarchal influence by advancing an overwrought caricature of paternal power. Meaning when the father is weak or absent, the sons step up and they have to act violently, sort of make sure everybody thinks everything's still really okay. Right? That is what modern zealotry is. That's the kind of zealotry that Pinchas is doing. That's the kind of zealotry that Shimon and Levi are doing. But there's always going to be a temptation to that because the idea that there may not be anybody in charge, nobody to sort of make sure things are stable and secure is not something that we're willing to be able to tolerate. So we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to try to just make some final points here. When you start looking at modern Jewish thinkers, extremist thinkers, zealots, who I think represent the worst kind of zealotry, one of the fascinating things that you have to keep in mind is that they seem to understand this exact point that I'm making here, right? That it's as if God is absent or weak, and that's why the zealot has to step in, right? And this is actually somewhat, again, implicit in the story of Pinchas itself, right? When God is describing Pinchas's actions, I put it here at the top, it's verse 11, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen heshivet chamati me'al bnei Yisrael. God says, Pinchas has ameliorated my anger. Why? Bikano et kinati, right? Pinchas has been zealous for my zealousness, right? And therefore I didn't destroy them in my zealotry, right? What the zealot does, and this is very, very important, is because if the father is weak or absent, the zealot steps into the father's place, right? The zealot is jealous for God in place of God being able to be jealous, right? And this, to a certain extent, explains the profound appeal of zealotry, because what does the zealot get to think at the end of the day, right? When there's that moment where there's just something that needs to be done, right? They get to see themselves stepping into God's shoes, right? They get to kind of see themselves as God, right? Because they know what God wants, what's necessary, what's needed, and they're going to do whatever it takes, right? In many ways, the appeal of zealotry is you get to be the father, right? You get to have that fantasy of being right and being powerful. But you only get to have that fantasy because God is absent. God's not doing what God's supposed to do, so you can step into God's shoes. And what's fascinating is the way that modern Jewish zealots of the worst kind sort of get that, right? Which is sort of like strange and deeply problematic, because it means that they're not really people of faith at the end of the day, right? When you realize how much they are motivated by God appearing weak or God appearing absent. Right? It's not supposed to be the position of a believing Jew, of a true position of faith, right? That God is weak and absent, therefore we step in. But that actually sounds like a modern secular position. That's what secular Zionists said, right? We have to step in and take responsibility for the Jewish people and our power, be our own power, take our own destiny in our own hands. That's the way zealots think. They just think they're doing it in a way that they can be what God really wants. So very briefly here, Meir Kahane, probably the leading Jewish zealot, racist, terrorist of the 20th century, he deals a whole theological notion of revenge that we won't get into. Revenge is classically seen as an act of zealotry, an act in which you basically punish your enemies, and therefore you defend your own honor. And one of the things that Meir Kahane notices here is that when the Jewish people are suffering, it is a moment in which it appears as if God is absent, right? That is, when things are suffering, when things are bad, it's as if God isn't there at all. And that is the exact moment when the Jew has to be willing to take revenge, because by taking revenge, we fill that gaping hole of God's absence. Right? He actually says this almost here in the Hebrew. It's like we give life back to God by killing our enemies. Now, that does not really sound like a statement of faith, right? That sounds like a roundly secular statement. That's literally what he says. And he tries to frame it in religious language. But again, he's getting at what I keep pointing out, which is when the father's not there or the father is weak, we have to step in and be the father. And we have to be as extreme as possible in doing so. Again, but he's in stating this, he's kind of revealing the emptiness of his own position, ironically enough. Yitzhak Ginsburg, who again is a contemporary rabbi here in Israel, also an extremist, also has defended violence and terrorism, wrote an article praising Baruch Goldstein, who killed almost 30 Palestinians in Marat Machpelah, 30 years ago. He also recognizes there's something about the act of zealotry that, again, it's like you're stepping into God's shoes, like you're forcing God's hands. He says here, he notes that maybe zealotry is not always such a good thing. It can lead to dangerous consequences. But he says it appears as an attempt, the act of zealotry, to force, as it were, God and his long-term plans to the I, the here, and the now. Right? There's an attempt with the act of zealotry to like force redemption. Right? We're going to step into God's shoes because God's not doing what God's supposed to do. We're going to be the zealots. We're going to make it happen in the here and now, which again is radical in the almost idolatrous sense. Right? Anytime you think you're stepping into God's shoes, you're not doing something that's very Jewish at all. Right? You're essentially making a God out of yourself, and you're acting zealously out of this fantasy. Right? And that's the challenge with zealotry, is the fantasy that fuels it, a fantasy of power, but a fantasy of power that is meant to cover up powerlessness, right? Like the people who become the great fascists of the 20th century, and maybe unfortunately the fascists of the 21st century, right? They're often actually kind of physically weak and unimposing, but the whole goal is to like pretend as if they're like these mighty militant, leaders or something like that. Right? I'm not going to name names, but it's actually in their weakness we have to project on the fantasy of power, right? And that's what the zealot is always trying to do at the end of the day. The last point I want to make about zealotry that I think is also of great importance for us goes back to this initial point about the fact the rabbi said, if you're a rabbi and somebody asks you whether you can be a zealot or act zealously, you don't answer them. Now, what's fascinating is there are Jewish texts that see this as a good thing. Right? What do I mean by this? Well, they see it that this is what the Chidushei HaRim says, a Hasidic Rebbe. He says that if you have to ask a question about whether or not you should be zealous, that's a sign that your zealotry is impure, right? If you have to stop what you're doing, like you see the horrible thing happen, But you have to like stop what you're doing and go call your rabbi and have a whole discussion with him. That's a clear sign that you're not being motivated for the right holy reasons, right? Like what the Chidushei HaRim wants to argue is that it's the fact that the zealot acts in the midst of the moment that proves the purity of their zealotry, right? They just react. They respond. It's spontaneous, right? It's as if God's wrath, God's spirit is like filling them up. And that's what gives it its authenticity and its legitimacy. You know, it's striking when I read this again. I mean, there's a sense in which people think about zealotry this way, is that I think, you know, with the self-awareness we have today, I think most of us realize that your first reaction to something is probably not the right reaction, right? That's like the most important lesson you can learn is when you become an adult, is your first response to seeing something that upsets you is probably not the correct response. And the goal shouldn't be like, how do I transform my anger into violence to be able to impose my will, right? Like that's the lesson we all have to learn. It's called like growing up, like you're not God, right? You don't get to run things. That's not the way the world can be. And what's fascinating is that on a sort of Jewish level, this becomes of profound importance, because if the fantasy of the zealot is they get to step into God's shoes, right? They get to do what God wants or God needs, but God can't do because God is powerless, that you can you can act zealously and feel completely legitimated, like you're on the right side of history. Judaism, halacha, the Torah isn't going to allow you to do that. Margiliot Yam, which is a commentary on Sanhedrin, basically notes that this permission to act zealously is not recorded in Shulchan Aruch. And he cites an opinion that says the reason that it's not recorded in the Shulchan Aruch, the classic book of Jewish law, is because you can't teach somebody to do this. And he also notes something else, that perhaps the law of zealotry doesn't even apply anymore. Perhaps it only applied at a time when there was a Sanhedrin, when there could be a death penalty. But if we have no Sanhedrin and we don't do the death penalty, the law doesn't even apply at all. And what the Margiliot Yam is saying here is that we have to be open to the possibility that zealotry is never legitimate, at least not today. Without a temple, without a Sanhedrin, without the death penalty, zealotry is never legitimate. And what we have to take away from this is that when the zealot acts zealously, they don't get to do it with the confidence that they are correct, that they are stepping into God's shoes, that this is the right thing, that this is necessary, that it is what God wants over and above everything else, right? The true Jewish zealot has to act without certainty. They have to act knowing they might be wrong. Or as the rabbis pointed out with Pinchas, they did this horrible thing, but it happened to be the right thing at that moment. But there was like this much leeway where that could be, and he couldn't have picked up that spear with confidence knowing that it was going to end right, right? The whole appeal of being the zealot is you get to think God, wants this more than anything else in the world. But the true Jewish zealot, if they're going to pick up that spear, they have to be fully open to the possibility that they're nothing more than a murderer. No zealot wants to think that. All zealots want to have the fantasy of stepping into God's shoes. And the real challenge of true zealotry, and there may be moments that require it, is you have to take the risk. You have to take the risk, not just that you might be wrong, that you might be a murderer, that you might be engaging in an act of profound evil. If at that point you're still willing to go through with it and accept the consequences, then maybe you deserve to be called a true zealot. But I've never really met somebody that is, fundamentally willing to take that on at the end of the day, because what would be the point of that? Why would anybody want to take that risk? But that is the challenge of zealotry. There are moments that may require it. I don't have time to look at it, but Sadok actually talks about this. He gives the example of Yael and Sisera, Yael who seduced and killed Sisera, who was the sort of Philistine general oppressing the Jewish people, or Esther who slept with Ahasuerus to save the Jewish people. These are acts that in the moment, there's no way to redeem them, right? Like they don't know what the outcome is going to be, and it may very well just be a sin. Yet Esther and Yael, and even Shimshon, he goes on to describe, they do this knowing that they might be doomed, knowing that their actions may lead to horrific consequences, but they do it because they feel they don't have a choice, right? That they're willing to take that on, they're willing to take the risk. And that's the kind of zealotry that potentially can be redemptive, but that's the kind of zealotry that's pretty hard to find. That is the challenge today at a time in which we don't really know who's in charge, or society, or men, women, or whoever. When things sort of seem to be falling apart, the temptation is we're going to step in and we know what God wants. We're going to put things right. But that fantasy, again, more often leads to a profanement of God's name than a sanctification of God's name. And the true zealot is the one who's willing to take the risk, knowing that they, might be wrong. So I'll stop there. I probably went a little bit over time, but I apologize for that. But I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there's time. I think you're good to go. You have a question?
I'd like to ask the regarding zealotry and stepping into God's shoes. that part, not negative or positive. But I'm concerned with the following point. We have a lot of positive actions in our lives, which we add to our religion. Ultimately, are stepping into God's shoes, things that God isn't doing. We want tikkun olam. We apply ourselves positively to those things. We want equality between different sexual preferences, and therefore we go ahead, even though the nagging feeling always in the back of the mind is the Torah says that this is asur, and yet we are stepping into a breach because God is powerless here. We're stepping into his shoes. I'm curious if you read that one is a country, that one aspect of stepping in to the shoes of a powerless God is different than the other.
So I think you raise a very important point, because every time we operate in the breach or outside the sort of the boundaries of the law, and modernity is about sort of, that's where we all are. We're all in the breach. The question is, how do we respond to that from a religious, perspective? That's always the challenge and the danger of it. So I'll say, first off, I'll say is that, the traditional Jewish approach is that we simply reinterpret the law in a way that makes us recognize that what we're doing is not a rupture, but a continuation of what came before. Now that's really hard to do, but it's the only way to do it like authentically. So that's like, point one. If you see the interpretation of halacha as a rupture, right, then you're no longer doing halacha. And there are people who think about that. We just take psukim, we rip psukim out of the Torah to make it the Torah that we want, right? Like that's never going to work. Like, I'm sympathetic to those who want to say we shouldn't read certain verses on the Yom Kippur Mincha because they describe sexual activities that we don't think are a problem in a way that is, really upsetting to us. That we shouldn't read those verses, right? Like, I'm not okay with that because I just don't think that's the Jewish response. That's point one. Point two is, even if we do that, we're going to reinterpret, right? We can't do it with this sense of certainty that we are 100% right. And our sort of the way we position halacha, the way we interpret halacha has to kind of reflect that. That's not an easy place to hold. But if we have to be able to hold positions in which we may find out that we can be wrong, right? We can still hold those positions, we can still reinterpret, but it can't reinterpret in such a way that we can never find our way out again, if that makes sense. So I think that is, that's what it means. That's the true zealots. We're going to reinterpret the law, but we have to be open to the fact that maybe we'll be proven wrong at some point in the future. Because the alternative is, when the moment comes where we might be proven wrong, we just won't be open to it. We'll reject it out of hand. We'll be, we'll maintain stubbornly our own wrong position. And that's the real challenge. But it's an excellent point. I didn't have time to get at this, but to be outside the law, to be a zealot is also like the place of chesed, right? It's the place of excess. I mean, this is better than anybody. Place of excess, right? And so the place in which the most redemptive good can happen is also the place where the worst transgression can happen. They happen in the same thing. That was the example that we see with Pinchas. The examples I mentioned about Esther and Yael and even Shimshon are all like that. But the challenge is the only way to get there is by taking that risk. And that's what makes it so scary. Most zealotry is cheap zealotry. They know they're right going into it, right? That's not what zealotry means, because to act outside the law, you can't be grounded in authority. Nobody's going to tell you. Meaning, if a rabbi tells you the zealotry is permitted, guess what? The rabbi is actually not a rabbi at that moment, because they've proven they don't understand the halacha properly. And if you offer a ruling that is prima facie incorrect, then your authority is basically erased in that moment. So even if somebody tells you can be a zealot, the very fact they tell you means they're not an authority you can ground the act, which means that you still have no legitimacy, right? But to be a zealot always means to be sort of floating on air, right? There's no firm ground under your feet, but you feel nonetheless that you have to act, right? That is
it's as if it is an act of God of which you are the vehicle.
Well, there's the thing, it may be redemptive. That can only be known after the fact. It cannot be known beforehand. Right. That's what I would say. And again, the temptation is going into it, seeing yourself as if it's certain and it's God and it's redemptive. right? That's what Ginsburg points out. When Baruch Goldstein was gunning down Palestinians in Marat Machpelah, may Goldstein's name forever be, erased forever for the horrible things that he did. Hard not to imagine that he had a smile on his face, thinking that he was God's instrument at that point, doing what was absolutely necessary. Right? That's what's so, profoundly scary about the Zealots. Right? There's a certain perversion of all that is correct in their actions. And if there's one thing Judaism cannot tolerate is when humans think that they are God, right? Like that is the danger that the Torah stands against with all of its might. But we live in a moment where that temptation is very, very real. Rabbi Lehman, who I'm speaking to, I happen to know him outside, but he lives in Yerushalayim too. He knows that temptation is like politically and religiously just in the air. And it's not that there may not be moments where we may be drawn to it, and that it can have profound need and positive consequences. We have to be fully aware of what we're getting into and the dynamics of what are taking place.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rabbi Zach. We are at our times, but we deeply appreciate you for such a great class today. Truly thought-provoking, and makes us think inward on when we try to play as God and when we try to justify some of our actions.
I'll say this, that nonviolent resistance, which can have a sense of zealotry, part of what makes it so powerful is that it is not violent, right? Nonviolence can still be power, but there's something about nonviolent resistance, which I know is at the heart of social justice that our aesthetic engages in, that can be redemptive in a much more possible way than violent, resistance ever can be. So I think there's many ways in which zealotry can exist. And Martin Luther King, helped show us that they can be redemptive and powerful, that don't so easily just immediately fall into these dangers that are just as hard, right? Even when you're chained to a police car, there's no guarantee that's going to work out well for you or achieve what you want, right? Quite the opposite, in fact. It can end far, where you see this today, right? It can end far, far worse, right? But that's the risk when you're trying to change the world.
Without a doubt. Thank you so much for all of you who are listening and who enjoyed today's class. We deeply appreciate Rabbi Zach and all of his great work. We will be posting a link to the sources and a link to a recording later on this week. Appreciate you. Have an amazing day. Take care, everybody.